doing their rounds as we await the High Court's ruling on this matter. Wakili, it is an hour and a half later, still no word from
yes,
the High Court as regards, the issue to do with the KDF, and it is slowly turning into nightfall.
Yes.
Still, this hangs at bay. We do not know what to expect as of now.
Yes, that is
it is
Mugambi, but sometimes you understand the pressure that our judicial officers sometimes find themselves in. But of course, we have faith in the judiciary and the officers, and particularly at this point, faith in the Honorable Justice Mugambi, who had all the parties who were before him this morning, and the oral hearings went up until early afternoon.
Yeah, and over 1,000, I'm seeing actually over 1,000 people have joined the virtual proceedings for the case of the LSK versus CS Duale.
Yes. And maybe that is also one of the reasons, because normally we are not used to be over 200 in court, in one particular court link. And maybe those are some of the technical issues he's facing. We don't want to speculate, but definitely he has to give some direction. He will give directions whether the ruling is ready, whether it is not ready, and when he will deliver it. But definitely before the end of the day, whether it is midnight or whatever time, before he leaves office, I am sure he will have given directions on that.
And talking about, as we wait for this ruling, the government through the Attorney General, Justin Muturi, defended the deployment of the KDF on grounds that the law was followed in the publication of the Gazette notice, but the LSK disagrees.
Yes, we disagree, and the reason why there is that disagreement is that the Gazette notice was there for everyone to see it on the night of Tuesday night. And it was also there for everybody to see that it had not been approved. Parliament had not discussed that prior to the issuance of that Gazette notice, and Parliament actually sat after the fact, and they sat and passed it retrospectively, which cannot work, because the law of or the principle of how laws are formulated is that you cannot begin with the fact and then you promulgate a law that will now govern what you already did. No. That is not how it works. You have to follow the procedure, and if you don't follow the procedure that is set, you are about to fail. And those were the arguments before the court this morning. And the defense, that is the Attorney General and the CS, through their representatives, they tried to defend the same, but I don't want to preempt what Justice Mugambi is going to say in his ruling, but in my own opinion, that was a very wrong move. You cannot execute or you cannot pass a law and then, or rather a gazette notice, and then you follow approving on the following day. That is not just right, and those are the reasons why actually Kenyans are actually maybe on the streets, and they're saying we don't have faith, or we don't actually trust the authorities, because you tell us one thing today, the following day you will do exactly the opposite. Therefore, those are the reasons, because you cannot tell us that a whole cabinet secretary can gazette deployment of police officers at night, and then the following day the parliament can come and try to, for lack of a better word, sanitize that process. It cannot be, unless we have just slided maybe into lawlessness and disobedience of rule of law. We have to follow procedure. Yeah,
let's talk about the fact that the National Assembly also approved, now moving away from the Attorney General, the National Assembly also approved the deployment of the Kenya Defence Forces to support the police, and this is where your bone of contention lies, in when the National Assembly was asked the police, and this is where your bone of contention actually brought in as regards this Gazette notice and their approving of the deployment of the Kenya Defence Forces to support police amid ongoing anti-finance bill protests. The National Assembly, are the representatives of the people, and therefore by them approving the deployment of the Kenya Defence Forces, what then does this message send? These are the very same people who have since gone on recess.
Yes, and this is the thing with this country, and you do know that the legislature is independent, or rather it is supposed to be independent. As to whether the current legislature is independent is debatable.
And actually there was an MP who criticized this decision on his X account, saying this was done without the media, without most members, without proper debate. In a record 30 minutes, the National Assembly had actually approved for the deployment of the KDF or the deployment of the KDF without indicating where, why, or for what period.
Yes, and that those are some of the reasons that we actually, that also LSK actually presented before court. The issue of deployment of the KDF is not a small issue. It is actually a very serious issue. That is the last resort of defense as a country. And therefore, if we are unleashing it, we have to be very sure of what we want to do. We have to be very sure that the situation warrants their deployment. And we are saying that according to where we sit, we don't see as if this circumstance warrants their deployment. Because first, the circumstances as they are, you cannot have protesters protest on, I think, 2 days last week and 1 week on this week, 1 day this week, and then you unleash on them Kenya Defence Forces.
Hold that thought, Wakili. Let's listen in. We are seeing tension there in the CBD here in Nairobi. Let's listen in to what is happening there. And in news just in, we're getting reports that the High Court ruling as regards whether or not the KDF will be deployed has been pushed to 5:20 p.m. That is, of course, following the Law Society of Kenya moving to court protesting the government's decision to deploy KDF officers in the wake of anti-finance bill protests. The ruling by Judge Lawrence Mugambi has been moved to 5:20 p.m. We are awaiting that. High Court Judge Lawrence Mugambi will this evening at 5:20 p.m. deliver a ruling on whether he will suspend government decision to deploy KDF officers or not. The judge will give out directions after hearing parties in the case. LSK, through its president Faith Odhiambo, insisted that the deployment of officers is unconstitutional and is meant to scare and intimidate Kenyans not to exercise their constitutional rights. However, the Attorney General and the Ministry of Defense lawyers submitted that there is need to have the KDF officers, adding that there is, in fact, a state of emergency in the country. And according to the respondents, deployment of KDF officers has been done before, and this is not the first case. They argued that there are no irregularities in the Gazette notice issued by Defense CS Aidan Duale. We are waiting that ruling by the High Court at exactly 5:20 p.m. this evening. The ruling was supposed to be made at 3 p.m., but there has been a delay in that, and we are just about under an hour away to hear what the court rules on this matter. Wakili,
yes,
we have up to 5:20 to hear what the High Court has ruled as regards the KDF. But even as we wait for that, we're seeing, pictures coming showing that, there is no end in sight as regards to whether people will be leaving the CBD or not. We're still seeing the police trying to contain people there, and therefore this ruling will make a difference as regards what is going to be happening within the city centre, and even the presence of pockets of the military that we've seen. Once the ruling is out, if it does rule in favour of the LSK, do we then expect not to see these people milling about anymore?
Yes, first, I think the magnitude of protests and demonstrations today have scaled down. You cannot compare them with Tuesday's or last week's demonstration. Therefore, even as we wait for the ruling by the Honorable Justice Mugambi, it is also good to marry that with the circumstances of the ground, that it is actually no longer necessary to deploy such forces or Kenya Defence Forces to the streets or within the confines of our republic. However, in the wisdom of the National Security Council and the CS for Defense, they thought it twice to have this deployment. And the question, the real question, or the elephant in the room is why? Because the magnitude of the protests have actually gone down. There is no circumstance that ushered or showed instability or unruliness or how lawlessness had maybe declined in a way that required deployment of the Kenya Defence Forces. So the questions that really begs is, why is the government hell-bent on deploying the defence forces on its citizens? And that is why I'm asking, is there something that we don't know, or is there something that they are not telling us? Because if you look at the situation and the circumstances that we have been seeing the entire of today and those of Tuesday, I don't think there has been anything as to show or as to necessitate deployment of KDF. Maybe, just maybe, the infiltration or the occupation of State House by civilians and the touching of a part of City Hall and the Supreme Court building or outside Supreme Court. Maybe that is what necessitated. But really, is that how fast we can be able to deploy the defense forces? I don't think so.
And speaking of the Kenya Defence Forces, they were seen patrolling city streets on Thursday, that is today, as before the High Court delivered its ruling, and therefore they are, or rather have still been seen patrolling, city streets before this ruling is made by the High Court on whether to suspend their deployment, or rather to suspend the deployment of the military as part of reinforcement plans to neutralize chaotic scenes during the anti-finance bill demonstrations. And what we saw earlier was the KDF personnel snaking through protesters, but they did stay short of engaging them. And the deployment of the military to quell protests has been deemed unconditional by a section of leaders and Kenyans. However, police, on the other hand, continue to lob tear gas canisters as pockets of protesters continue to make their way around the city. And of course, for those attempting to access the CBD, they are also being kept at bay by the tear gas. But unlike Tuesday's protests, when the city was full of thousands of protesters by 2 p.m., today seems to be a different day. Police have managed to keep protesters out of the city, and the number of protesters are visibly low as compared to those that were witnessed on Tuesday. That turned violent. Let's listen into what's happening in Eldoret. Okay, those are pictures from Eldoret. And those are earlier pictures that were in Eldoret. Peaceful protesters meeting there and probably, just waiting for a go-ahead from whoever it is that is directing them on what to do. They're also holding placards that read peace. Here in the city, that is Nairobi, we've seen police arresting some protesters who are participating in the demos. And High Court Judge Lawrence Mugambi will make the ruling at 5:20 after hearing the parties in the case filed by the Law Society of Kenya seeking to block the deployment of the military to assist the police. The deployment of the military was seen as necessary by Defense CS Aidan Duale following Tuesday's protests, where protesters in their hundreds engaged in violent protests in parts of the CBD. But the LSK, through its president, Faith Odhiambo, has argued that the deployment of KDF in the CBD is unconstitutional. And she has insisted, and the LSK in its entirety has insisted, that the procedure undertaken for approval was merely quote-unquote cosmetic. And the LSK president also told the court that the Gazette notice should have been given 24 hours after Parliament's approval. She did go on to say that what we are seeing, quote unquote, is Parliament and the executive treating us to a circus to cover up. She also said that such a scenario has never been seen since the 1982 coup. Now, this Gazette notice by Aidan Duale, the Defense CS, authorizing the deployment of the military, implies that police were overwhelmed in many parts of the country, or at least that's what the LSK argues is the case, but says that that was not in fact the case, that the police are capable of handling the situation of peaceful protesters, and therefore the support of the Kenya Defense Forces is actually not necessary, as it would actually amount to intimidation and what would be seen as a police state. Wakili, earlier we were talking about the lack of public participation, the fact that the media was actually not involved when the National Assembly was voting to approve the Gazette notice, or this move by Aidan Duale, the Defense CS, to call on the KDF to move in to assist the National Police Service?
You see, when something is, we are a country governed by the rule of law, really, and that is why we have institutions like the National Assembly, and that is why there would be a law, that is Article 241, and equally the Kenya Defense Forces Act, which also speaks to the procedure, the procedure that the Cabinet Secretary for Defense may use in requesting for approval of deployment, and also speaks into how that deployment is going to happen. Now, the reason why this thing is normally taken to Parliament is because of public participation, because you remember Article 2 of the Constitution says that the Constitution is supreme, and that the people can either exercise their power directly or indirectly through their elected representatives. Now, when it goes to Parliament, it is a form of public participation, so that members of Parliament are able to weigh in on the reasons that the national security